Hi, this is Laura Holyoke, and I have an introduction to the political lens / frame for you. So in contrast with the view that organizations are integrated, rational enterprises pursuing a common goal, aka, do you remember the structural lens? The political metaphor views organizations as loose networks of people with divergent interests who gather together for the sake of expediency. That is to make a living, developing a career, pursuing a desired goal or objective. So this is Gareth Morgan. Bowman and Deal tell us that interest, power, and conflict is really what organizational politics is about. And if we want to understand it, that we need to focus on the relations between these three elements. Note that your personal interests do not take your team's interest in mind, that you can understand politics if you look at what people have as in their best interests. And these are people that you are surrounded by. And when somebody else goes to complain about something, maybe think about what sort of conflict is there, or what sort of interests collide. So personal interests include, and each one of us has these extramural interests. So these are our life outside of the organization. It's our personalities, what we value, our preferences, our private attitudes, what we believe in. We also have career interests. So these are aspirations, what we want to do, what the future may hold for us long term. And then task or job interests. These are connected to the work that we need to perform to get our jobs done. And sometimes we really need certain resources to complete our jobs and our tasks in ways that we think is best. So conflict arises whenever interests collide. Conflict can be personal, it can be interpersonal, or even between rival groups or coalitions when they're formed. It can be built into organizational structures, just how organizations are set up and how people maybe garner resources, the roles that people play, attitudes, and then stereotypes. And they usually arrive over a scarcity of resources. Also, conflict can be overt or it can be covert. Responses to conflict vary on a spectrum from passive to avoid it completely. And then less completely avoiding would just be accommodating. Compromising is giving up. Collaborating is joining up. And then competing is going all in. So power then is the capacity that a person has to influence the behavior of another person. And our general response to power is usually power, that we go to war. But speaking of influence, Bowman and Deal talk about, I think his name is pronounced Saldini, but I can't remember. I've heard a couple people say it correctly. Anyway, this is how people go about influencing others. So they use reciprocation. If you do this for me, I'll do that for you. Commitment and consistency. If you just take one small step and then you're on the path. So be consistent and continue taking small steps. Social proof, to show that everybody else is doing this, or it's what's happening right now. So get on board because somebody likes them. You like me, so therefore I might influence you. I have the authority over you, which is a great influence technique. And then scarcity. So hurry up and do this because it's not going to be available for much longer. So if dependency is the key to power, what creates dependency? It's usually the importance of the resource to the organization or the group, or even an individual person. So somebody wants what you have, or you want what somebody else has. Usually a scarcity of resources because Resources are not in overabundance. And then how easy is that resource in terms of substitutability? So if there's fewer substitutions, then it holds more power. So responses to the use of power. These are a little bit like responses to the use of conflict, but one is compliance, to follow directions. Whether you agree or not, you just comply. Or you can resist. You can act deliberately to not do what the person in power is telling you to do or what the power structure says. Or you can even delay carrying out those orders. And then finally, you could be fully in. You could commit to the leader's viewpoint and carry out the instructions, and that become your what you believe in. We've talked about French and Raven's types of powers before. Referent power is a little the same as charismatic power, because you like people in terms of you like who they are. Legitimate power is also authoritative power. Coercive power is power used to harm another. Reward power is giving grades, giving ice cream, being able to give rewards, money. And then expert power is having and holding knowledge that other people don't have. And so their power bases are 5. And then Bowman and Deal talk about sources of power themselves. So they talk about the position power or authority, the control of rewards, coercive power, information and expertise, reputation. So if you look at those first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they're almost the same as French and Raven's. Alliances and network is also some form of referent power. Access and control of agendas oftentimes relates to authority or maybe expert. Framing relates to a little bit of all of the above. And then personal power is also some form of referent power. In addition to Bowman and Deal's list, I want to include some of Gareth Morgan's, has a list of most important sources of power that he talks about. And these are a little different from French and Raven and what Bowman and Deal listed. So I thought these are important to talk about. So use of an organizational structure, the rules and regulations. This is somebody that may not have a lot of power in terms of authority, but may know all the fine print in the faculty staff handbook, may know all the fine print on the policies and procedures, and can implement those. Control of scarce resources. So this is reward power, and scarcity and dependence are keys to resource power. What happens though is a minimum of what we can live on, we start to believe is what we're making. It's much easier to adjust upward than it is to adjust downward. Without slack resources, if somebody's controlling those scarce resources, it's hard to obtain innovation. No slack resources means that we're just having enough to get our task completed. And then incremental resources, when you get an increased slack, all of a sudden becomes a necessary part of a budget, if you will, once it's allocated. So let's say you received incremental resources for 2 years in a row. It's really increased slack. And then you start forgetting that it was slack. And then people adjust up and can they say, well, we can't live on less. Another area that gives a lot of power to people is the control of decision processes. So if you have an ability to influence the outcomes of the decision-making processes, that is to decide under what conditions or the premise of the decision. So what to frame a decision in a certain way or to define the constraints of a decision. Also, who gets to and how do they decide on the decision processes? So who gets to consider these alternatives? How do they consider them and by who? And then finally, the information that is shared about the alternatives in terms of here we can decide between A, B, or C alternative. So the evaluative criteria to be employed. So you can choose what to report or what information to give others in order for them to make a decision. Control of knowledge and information, and then control of boundaries is another one that Morgan has that I think is unique. And that's when somebody works in an interface between different elements of an organization, a lot of times this role does not have much authoritative power, but sometimes it's secretary, a special assistant, an admin assistant, project coordinator, have a lot more power than their formal status because they can control who gets in to see a CEO, who gets, and a lot of times a CEO or the person hiring will come and ask this person with less formal status what they think. Ability to cope with uncertainty. We often in our society want to know what's going to happen, and we don't want an unknown. But if we have an ability to stay with the uncertainty and not let it bother us, that gives a lot of power. And then control of technology. Organizations and individuals really become vitally dependent on some form of core technology as a means of converting or organizational inputs into outputs. So how this is controlled gives a lot of power. Interpersonal alliances, networks, control of informal organizations. So it's not what you know, it's who you know. The framing, the symbolism, if you can control symbols and management of meanings in organizations. And then also gender and the management of gender relations. So some organizations are dominated by gender-related values that bias organizational life in favor of one sex over another for whatever reason. And then finally, the power one already has. Power is a route to power, and one can often use power to acquire more. It's like it multiplies. And it seems like some people that once they get into power, and this isn't always bad, that because of who they are, it's so much easier to multiply their power. Some interesting structural factors that define the stage of action. So hardly anyone in an organization will admit to having any real power. Even our president answers to the board of directors, Idaho Education Board of Directors. I don't think I said that correctly. But given the numerous and varied sources of power, people and organizations feel powerless. So how is that so? That there can be so many sources of power, yet so much feeling of powerlessness? Okay, so I have some fun stuff for you here. This is Gareth Morgan again. He's got some power strategies for both female leadership and male leadership. So you can take some time going through these. And the very bottom says the Great Mother. So Delilah uses the powers of seduction to win over key figures in male-dominated organizations. And I think when you talk about and apply the political lens, it's kind of fun to look at different people, leaders, and what sort of power strategies they may or may not use. So I've got 2 slides of male leadership power strategies. From the father, the warrior, the playboy, the little boy, the good friend, the chauvinist pig, the jock. So you can read through those and look at stuff. So these, Gert Hofstede did a really large study that the Globe study also repeated, just with some different different areas that they looked at or named them different. But Hofstede found that we have high power distance cultures and lower power distance cultures. But you can also see in terms of high power distance organizations have a small, powerful elite. And the majority of the people that work in these organizations are relatively powerless, kind of like India and China as countries. And the elites are segregated. People also don't question those that are in the powerful positions. And education is not available to all, or professional development in organizations is not available to all. Where in low power distance cultures, it's the idea that people can start anywhere in the organization and move up to the top. If you think about how Les Schwab runs their organization, everybody, I think, has to start at the very bottom and work their way up. And then finally, some more wordplay. If you want to look at politics being in the eye of the beholder, what a political label may be. Scheming is actually effective management label of planning ahead. Ambitious may be career-minded. So if you'd like to rephrase something, here's a good list. Finally, the power of a boss is asymmetrical. It is easier to use authority to tighten up, shrink, and make an organization more cautious than it is to use power to open up, expand, and make an organization more courageous. There is a readiness of people in lower power positions to believe the worst. If it is fear we want to instill in our subordinates, they are quite ready to respond. And that's what happens a lot. However, on the other hand, if we want them to take more responsibility and to be political in a positive way, then you can read The Empowered Manager by Peter Block. But it's what I think when people get into power or leadership positions, it's much easier to call the shots. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.